So it has been an honor for me to be part of this initiative of developing the guideline, and I want to introduce to you part 1 of the guideline. What we have tried to establish here is 10 enabling elements for a successful NDRA. Just a quick word about myself. I'm a self-employed consultant on risk and crisis management, working mainly in the Netherlands but also across Europe. And in the field of risk assessment, I've been involved in the methodology committee for developing the Dutch national methodology. So that's why I became connected to this working group. Our 10 enabling elements cover 3 stages of the National Disaster Risk Assessment process. So stage 1, of course, preparing and also scoping. Then in second stage, conducting the actual risk assessment. And in the third stage, delivering the results for further decision making in disaster risk management. So first, talking about stage 1, we have identified 5 elements here. Well, the first key component, like Sahar also mentioned, is to have ownership and empower actual decision making on disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction policies. And for this, it's needed to have a governance mechanism that governs both disaster risk reduction and the element of understanding risk of actual developing a national disaster risk assessment. Well, the definition of governance, of course, is this full system of institutions and mechanisms that can provide this guidance, ownership, and involvement of stakeholders. And key elements for us was to, well, describe this governance as being transparent, inclusive, collective, and also efficient. And so, to make it more precise for the management of a disaster risk assessment process, we described the need for a lead agency. So this can be in many countries like the Ministry of Interior. We know countries where it is the Prime Minister's office. This really depends on the needs in a specific country. But clear ownership and coordination of the whole process is really key. As is a good coordination body to involve all these multi-stakeholders that you need in the process. Because based on the different sectors that need to be involved, potentially different government levels that need to be involved, you need to involve a lot of different stakeholders, and they need to feel their collective ownership of this process. Besides, let's say, policy ownership, you also need technical expertise in your process. So our recommendation is to have a specifically assigned technical committee that monitors the development of methodology, the quality of outcome, and also the data management. This whole principle of governance, this whole mechanism of governance, of course, has to be enshrined in a legal framework and legislation, with a clear role for this lead agency, and in several process agreements on data sharing, on use of experts, on use of actual outcome in decision-making processes. So, quick example on a governance mechanism, in this case actually from the Netherlands. We do have a national platform for disaster risk reduction with a ministerial steering committee, and they are the owner of the whole system. In turn, they have assigned a consortium led by the National Environmental Agency that really connects all experts and different stakeholders on regional level, critical infrastructure, industries, universities, into this network that actually performs the national disaster risk assessment. which is safeguarded by this technical committee, the methodology working group, of which I'm a member. So our second element in the guideline is the actual very important starting point of scoping. Because the end goal is to have a national disaster risk assessment that is really fit for purpose. So fit for purpose means before setting out on this, well, let's say quest, you need to really define what it is you're after. What kind of decisions you want to be informed on national level, but also what kind of definition of disaster risk or risk you are going to use. What are the societal values you want to protect against risk? Economy, human life, health, etc., etc., etc. This has to be said in the very first step of policy scoping to really understand what kind of methodology you will need later on. Also a very important step of this scoping is deciding on, I get some feedback now from, thank you, deciding on whether the national disaster risk assessment is going to be a national one, meaning risks that are relevant on national level for national government, or disaster risk assessment for the nation, which might include also very significant risks on lower subnational levels. This might not be the same, really depending on the system in a specific country. Also, of course, important part is the understanding of your current status. So, do you have current information and a current scope of existing NDRA? Whether to include only national or also local and sectoral risk assessments in an integrated process, or first, for example, only develop a national disaster risk assessment before maybe in second steps connecting to local level. And the same question for supranational risk. So in your governance mechanism, it might be relevant to think about connecting to other adjacent countries for risks that might be supranational. A time horizon actually is a policy question, but also a technical question for your national disaster risk assessment. So a normal time horizon that we have seen in several country cases is 4 years, because that's a planning process in many political systems. But disaster risk reduction requires long-term perspective, so you might want to have a time horizon that's also a little bit longer than 4 years, or at least gives an insight in developments after those 4 years, so you can inform long-term decisions, especially as we're talking about, if we would talk about climate change. Besides the policy scoping, you also have to do some technical scoping, so identifying what are the hazards that are relevant for our country, also identifying the exposure levels of different areas, so the spatial dimension of the risks in your country, to really understand what kind of areas you might want to involve in your process. And also scoping your vulnerability beforehand, so really getting a grip from your objective of NDRA, what kind of vulnerabilities, societal vulnerabilities you want to involve in your national disaster risk assessment. And the same for your capacities, what kinds do you want to be a part of your methodology and of your process. Still in the preparedness phase, element 3, data management plan. So here, this is where the lead agency will really have to coordinate the involvement of all stakeholders in unlocking their information, connecting their information based on data standards and understanding of the required quality and resolution, and if possible, to establish a common data repository where all these stakeholders can connect and share their information. For this, it might be needed to have a memorandum of understanding between all stakeholders that's sanctioned by your governance mechanism. We will have a presentation later on by one of the colleagues in much more detail about this element of data management. So before actually starting the actual process of NDRA, you will also have to look into the available and required capacities to actually do this process, to actually perform it. This might be administrative capacities, so capacities of governance, of decision making. Of course, financial, so really the level of finances available also define the detail of your assessment. And you will also have to establish what kind of technical capacities you have present in your country, or which you can attract from other institutions, because it's really a data and knowledge intensive process. So let's say your starting point here is to perform some sort of needs assessment. What do you need to reach this objective of your NDRA? Taking in mind it's the development of your NDRA capacities is best to be a long-term process. So really invest in not the first one, but in future development of your capacity. And then it finally, in your preparing of your NDRA, it comes down to setting your timelines, milestones, and deliverables to be able to manage it as a project. Although you want it to be a long-term, sustainable process, it has what needs a project document with clear roles, responsibilities to describe the involvement of all parties. So far, the preparedness phase, so the actual conducting of the risk analysis, we have defined 3 elements, enabling elements in that phase, starting with the selecting of your actual methodology. Well, best is to say not methodology, but methodologies, because it will be, in most cases, a set of or mix of different methods that together are fit for the purpose of your NDRA. So that's why we have put so much emphasis on the scoping part, on the policy scoping and the technical scoping, because this really defines what kind of methodology you are going to use. It's not one size fits all. Let's just copy paste methodology from one country to another. It really depends on the setting. For this selection of methodologies, we defined well, 3 different steps of assessment. So starting from individual single hazard analysis, which has very specific methodologies, then coming to aggregation and comparison of these different single hazards into an all hazard or multi-hazard perspective, because that's one of the main purposes of your NDRA, is to be able to compare all these different risks that are a threat to your country. And thirdly, to not only compare those different risks, but also have a look into the cascading, simultaneous nature, sequential nature of some interrelated hazards. And that might need some very detailed methodologies and insight later on. So single hazard methodologies, I will try to be brief here because you are as much an expert as I am, I presume. We described in the guideline several levels of methodology you could use there, starting from probabilistic. So really getting insight in the probability distribution of your hazards and associated impact levels. Secondly, the deterministic scenario approach, so describing your scenarios, evaluating, analyzing the impact and the correlating likelihood. Then, of course, there is historical loss database. This might be less useful, of course, in case of
low intensity risk, but for the more extensive, the more intensive risks, a historical loss database, loss data registration might be a very good source to understand your risk. And the final bottom line, if information is failing, if methodologies or models are failing, you will always have your national experts from various stakeholders and institutions that can do expert elicitation to really understand single hazards. So coming to the second step of aggregating risks, single hazards analysis to multi-hazard for hazards that are potentially, well, you can potentially model probabilistically. You can have more easily this aggregation, like using average annual loss. The same for historical loss values. You can sum them up, but of course, for the deterministic and scenario-based approach, it's not so easy to aggregate in a, let's say, a calculation. So you will need to set up a comparison methodology. Here we have identified two main approaches to this multi-hazard analysis. The first is scenario-based multi-criteria analysis. Those kind of methodologies, they focus on assessment of likelihood and impact of scenarios, of different stress test scenarios for your nation, for which you will have to set your impact criteria, impact levels, in a very transparent way in order to compare different kinds of scenarios of risks. There are a lot of examples of this kind of methodology, especially in Europe, Australia, Canada. The other kind of methodology for multi-hazard comparison is what we call index-based. The INFORM tool, the international INFORM tool, is one of the more famous ones there. So really assigning value to hazard levels and exposure levels for specific hazards, assigning levels value to vulnerability and lack of coping capacity based on very concrete indicators, and adding them up to a risk level indicator. Well, you see this mostly to compare different kinds of countries. You can use them for different areas within your country, but also to compare different hazards within your country. So to select the right methodologies from this whole overview of potential methods, we defined three kinds of criteria. So quality and appropriateness is the first. Your methods will have to be robust, of course, as robust as possible, and equally important, they will have to be appropriate to the scoping of your risk assessment. Really depending on whether you're focusing on, for example, spatial impact of your risk or impact on national economy, you might need different kinds of methods. Well, then there's always a balance between the resources that are available and the resources required to really perform the NDRA. In a lot of countries, this will be a careful balance. Especially in the first run of an NDRA, you cannot have a ambition level that is too high. And the third one is, of course, the significance of risk. So what we have been discussing in length is in some countries, in your actual scoping step of the NDRA, you might already know a lot about which risks are most significant. And without excluding all the other risks in your NDRA, you might want to invest some more resources, have a more sophisticated methodology for the risks that are really clearly the main ones for your country. Sahar, how much time do you give me now?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes?
To
okay, I will skip in that case the key considerations. Element 8, preparing the outputs. So what we have described in the guideline is a number of potential ways to communicate your NDRA. It's not just about having a document that's sent to Parliament, but you have to think about the risk communication also to the political decision makers, sectoral decision makers, and also the population in general. So you can see some of the potential ways also in the guideline. Coming to the last stage, so delivering the results. We have paid some extra attention to this stage because we didn't want to end just with the development of the actual document of an NDRA, because it has to inform the actual DRM process and decision making. So what we have described in this element is what kind of discussions you need to foster in your governance mechanism. It's about prioritization of different risks. It's about setting your acceptable levels of risk. But it's also about dealing with uncertainties, because the NDRA methodology will never give 100% foolproof answers on all accounts. So you will need to communicate very clearly to the decision makers what kind of uncertainties in the methodology and in the outcome there are. In the end, in element 9, it comes down to actual decisions. We have described some options for how to use NDRA results in decision making, and you can read them in more detail over there in the guideline. And finally, in element 10, we tried to give a long-term perspective on the NDRA to let it be more than just this project, but have a long-term sustainability. And our advice is to develop a sustainability plan with updating of the NDRA in future, financial strategy to develop your capacities in future, and also mechanisms for international exchange of experience. Well, in conclusion, what we think is very important in this whole process is to ensure this ownership of the national system for understanding risk. And for that, you will need this very transparent governance mechanism that relates understanding risk with disaster risk management. In the end, well, the holistic approach, I think, Sahar, you have really excellently told about the holistic approach. But finally, what I would like to say is be realistic in your implementation. So yes, it's about a long-term perspective of gradually improving your understanding of risk, but it has to start with realistic steps. So your first NDRA might be a subset of what it might be in future, in the long term.